Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar sponsored by the Office of Energy Transformation for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Today, we'll be doing an informational webinar on one of our focus area work groups, Financing the Transition. I'm Melissa Labinson. I am the Executive Director of the Office of Energy Transformation, and I'm going to be joined today by Sue Tierney, of the analysis group. Sue was previously a commissioner with the Department of Public Utilities, as well as Secretary of Environmental Affairs for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And today, the two of us are going to be going over a few things. We're going to do an agenda review, and then we're going to go over what the Office of Energy Transformation is and some context for why it was created and the focus area work group that we are going to be discussing today. Then Sue will provide an overview and background on how the electric grid is changing, investments and how they're recovered, the policy context, customer and grid needs, utility regulation, and rate making. And then we'll go over the Financing the Transition work plan and future convenings for this work group. And then we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So a couple of housekeeping items at the beginning. This is an informational webinar. We will have an opportunity for question and answer via the Q&A function on the Zoom. So as you have questions, please type them into the Zoom. We'll get to them all at the end, and the ones we don't get to, we will send out in writing. There will be information at the end of today's webinar about how you can sign up to be part of this focus area work group and how you can participate going forward. There'll be that we'll put that sign up in the chat function, and then we will also have that available on the Office of Energy Transformation website under the Financing the Transition working group tab on that website. So I'm going to kick us off. So a little bit of background and policy context for why the office was created and what we're focused on. I think as many people know that might be joining us today on the Zoom, Massachusetts has leading climate and clean energy policies in the state. Many of those have been enshrined into law, including our mandate to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, as well as the pathway to get there, which is an electrification-based pathway focused on deploying and increasing the amount of renewable energy that will be developed and consumed in the state, as well as electrifying transportation and increasing the efficiency of our built environment. Many of those laws have been now put into programs and regulations, and we've been implementing them, and we've been making very good progress toward meeting our climate and clean energy goals. And we've been doing it not only in a way that's meeting our on track to meet our 2025 goals, but also in a way that is focused on equity, affordability, economic opportunity, and environmental justice. And that is really a lens that we put in place, particularly in the Haley Driscoll administration. As we focused on these policies, we want to do it in a way that's equitable, affordable, and that's advancing economic opportunity. And that's part of what we're focused on today. And that's part of the mission and the charge of this Office of Energy Transformation. The office was established in May of 2024, really focused on the hands-on execution of the clean energy transition, including that gas to electric coordination, electric grid readiness, and as I mentioned, a just and equitable transition for workers, businesses, and communities. And when we established the Office of Energy Transformation, not only did we establish the charge for this office, but we also wanted to make sure that we were bringing in the breadth of the energy ecosystem into the work that we were doing. And so we established an Energy Transformation Advisory Board. That advisory board consists of about 70 individuals from across the energy ecosystem here in the Commonwealth. And they had their first meeting on September 30th of this year. And in that first meeting, they established a few things. They created the bylaws and the way that this office was going to be governed, as well as signed off on 3 of the focus areas, one of which is the Financing the Transition focus area that we're talking about today, but I'll go a little bit into what the other focus areas are as well. The first focus area that you see here on to the left of the screen is transitioning away from the Everett Marine Terminal LNG facility. That focus area will be launched with a webinar on November 4th, and information on that and how you can sign up will be available on the Office of Energy Transformation website later this week. The second focus area, decarbonizing the peak, we launched that one on October 8th, and we have had signups for stakeholders to participate in that webinar. I'm sorry, in that working group, and we will be sending out confirmations to those stakeholders that have signed up, those individuals that have signed up to participate in that work group, and that work group will launch in mid-November. And then we have today's work group, Financing the Transition. Each of these focus areas we're launching with these informational webinars. So again, today's webinar will be for information only. We will be taking questions to provide some additional detail into areas that folks might have questions about today, but we'll be kicking off this work group in earnest later this fall. And so we'll provide more information on next steps and how you could sign up, as I said, at the end of this webinar. So a couple things for folks as we move through this, so you can start to think about whether or not you'd like to be part of a broader working group on financing the transition. A couple of things. One, governance. As you saw on the previous slide, we have an advisory board. That advisory board really acts as a board of directors that all recommendations from working groups are going up to that advisory board, which will debate and work with the Office of Energy Transformation on how to move those recommendations forward. For this focus area work group, a couple of things. One, these working groups will meet on a bi-monthly basis or more often as needed. Anybody can participate in these working groups, and as we develop these working groups, we're going to have individual work streams, and folks can participate in sub-elements of this working group, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The work streams and the work of these working groups, they are under Chatham House rules so that we can have free-flowing conversations, but once recommendations are made to the advisory board, all of those will become publicly available, and they will be put on the Office of Energy Transformation website. And we're really going to be working towards consensus and developing work products and recommendations to the advisory board. And where consensus isn't available, we will be noting the positions of various participants so that the advisory board can really understand the breadth of stakeholders and where everybody is on a variety of issues. In terms of the responsibilities, so the responsibilities of the work group is to execute the work plans that the advisory board has approved, to establish the work stream teams. So as we go through this, you'll see that there's going to be some sweat equity involved in participating in one of these work groups. And so as we establish what needs to get done, we'll be pulling groups together to do that. And again, really working towards consensus. We really do want this to be a consensus-oriented approach that we're taking here. And so that's why we're going to be moving through everything in a very methodical basis. And I'll get to that in the next slide. And then in terms of expectations, the expectation is that if you're participating, that you're going to be an active participant in this work group, that you do have a command of the subject matter expertise. And that when we have meetings, we are welcoming multiple participants from an organization. But when we get to the point of moving forward with recommendations and trying to achieve consensus, we're going to ask for one position per organization that's participating. So again, if you want to have multiple people from your organization participate in this work group, that's fine. But when we do move towards consensus, we'll need to have a consensus position from the organization and speaking with one voice during those meetings. So in terms of how we're going to move through a process, each of the working groups is going to be following a similar methodology. And it's really in 3 phases, and this was approved by the advisory board. The first phase is really, we're talking about starting with an understanding of the issues, the perspectives, and assessing the current state of what the topic we'll be discussing. And that's part of what this informational webinar is about today. And Sue will go through that to really make sure that folks do have a baseline understanding of where we are on our subject matter and kind of the issues that are out there and the perspectives of various participants and stakeholders. Then as we move through it, we'll be looking at assessing and identifying alternatives and potential solutions. So for this one, financing the transition, what we're really going to be focusing on is looking at potential alternative ways of paying for the utility distribution system infrastructure upgrades that we're currently paying for in utility bills. Are there other financing mechanisms, other approaches to paying for those investments other than putting them on a utility bill? That's really the focus of this. So we're going to be looking at what are potential solutions, what are potential alternatives, and then finally conducting an implementation assessment to making recommendations to that advisory board. So again, really moving through things in a methodical way, starting with understanding, then identifying alternatives, then looking at implementation and potential recommendations. And so folks that are participating in these working groups really are asking people to work through the process in this way so that we're really committing to work together and aligning around this understanding. We're really committing to engaging and enabling outcomes and sharing and understanding perspectives, and that we'll be working together to implement and sustain these recommendations. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sue, who's going to go through some of the background information on financing the transition, and then we'll go into some deeper detail in terms of how we're going to move through and the next steps in the process and how you can sign up.
Thank you, Melissa. It's nice to be with everyone today. I want to just start with 2 points. One of them is that I'm working with my colleague, Paul Hibbard from Analysis Group. He is formerly chair of the Massachusetts DPU. I wonder if yeah, that would be great to stay there. And we are really happy to be supporting the working group. And second, as Melissa said, today's webinar is intended to be a baseline setting presentation to you. Many of you on the list of participants is quite familiar with the topics that I'm going to be covering. In fact, there are some experts who are joining us today. So I'm doing my best to try to find a middle ground to bring those who are not expert up to speed on the electric industry, utilities and their role in this, investment and regulation. So with that, let me start by saying that electric utility refers in this context to electric companies that deliver power to end use or retail electricity customers. And there are lots of other players in the electric industry in Massachusetts and in New England, things like companies that own power plants, and typically they are not utilities. So when I use the word utilities today, and I assume as we're talking about that in this working group, we are talking about electric distribution companies who have the wires to local consumers and are regulated, as I'll be going over more today. In Massachusetts, we have 3 investor-owned electric distribution companies. They are Eversource, that's shown in green and turquoise on this map. National Grid, shown in violet and purple on this map, and Unitil, which is shown in yellow. And the other entities are 41 municipal light plants, and they are publicly owned utilities, much smaller scale, and are often part of the local government in their communities. 90% of electricity consumers are served by these 3 EDCs, electric distribution companies, and I'll use EDCs or utilities synonymously today. Since the electric industry was restructured more than 20 years ago, and at a time when there was a desire to increase competition in the supply of power production in the state, utilities do not own power plants for the most part. There are some minor exceptions. So we think about EDCs as building, maintaining, operating the grid or the wires, the high voltage and low voltage distribution lines, things like substations, poles, transformers, utility trucks, and so forth. And these utilities purchase and resell power only to consumers who haven't chosen to purchase power from a competitive supplier or from a municipal aggregator in certain towns or cities where municipal aggregation has occurred. Next, please. Melissa, would you move that forward, please? Thank you. So this is a picture of the New England grid. And next, you can see that Massachusetts, which is blown up there or expanded, of course, is part of New England, and it's fully interconnected with the other 5 states in New England. The blue lines are the really high voltage lines, and you can see a couple of things about this grid. One of them is that, again, there are lines all over the place. There are more high voltage lines in southern New England, which is a higher density population and an economically developed area. I don't mean to say more economic development, but it's less rural, let's say, less. It's more densely populated in southern New England. New England is connected to New York, to Quebec and New Brunswick as well through power lines that go and cross those borders. And the lines tend to be in looping fashion, so that if a power plant on one transmission line goes out, or if a line goes out, say in bad weather, the power can loop around and flow to consumers through more than just one pathway. So we call this an interconnected electricity grid. Next. So this is the current grid, and this is the historical daisy chain, so to speak, or supply chain of power production with electricity generation, where power plants, we have 400 or so in this region, they inject power into the grid. The transmission system, which is high voltage transmission, and the substations move that power across the interstate grid and deliver it and transform it down to lower voltage levels. And it's carried through the distribution system, which is thousands of miles of local wires, some above ground, some underground, and those then deliver power to consumers. And consumers, when I say the word consumers, I mean not just households, of course, but I mean businesses, nonprofits, universities, manufacturing facilities, everybody. And recently, we have begun to see, as many of you know, the advent of more power generation at small scale located on the top of rooftops or on the customer's side or elsewhere on the customer side of the electricity meter. And we have lots of installations in the region that are now injecting power into the grid, in addition to providing power on site for the premises and the users there. Next, please. So who regulates rates? There are 2 basic components of rates. One is delivery, and I'm going to talk about delivery in a minute, and the other is supply, electricity power production. So delivery, especially distribution level delivery or lower voltage, and sales to retail consumers or end use consumers are regulated by the Department of Public Utility. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates the cost of service of a high voltage transmission system, the interstate grid, as well as regulating the terms and conditions of supply of sales of power at the wholesale level. So sales from a power producer to a third party, such as a utility or a marketer, and then those third parties then sell to end use consumers. FERC regulates the wholesale piece. And electric supply charges in Massachusetts, which are the power production or commodity supply portion of a rate, reflect different combinations of service. Basic service prices, those are competitively procured power resources that the utility has arranged, and the DPU oversees that procurement of power. Again, the utilities don't own power plants for the most part, and they have to get it from the marketplace. The DPU looks at those terms and conditions. And then there are two forms of competitive supply. One in which a marketer sells to a commodity service to an end use consumer, and the sales are competitively priced, and those appear on the bill of the consumer that's provided to the consumer by the utility, the local utility. And then there are municipal aggregation programs for those communities that have received approval from the DPU to go out and procure power for everyone in the community. And people can opt out if they want to get supply from basic service or competitive supplier, but otherwise the municipality is going to the marketplace and procuring power according to the kinds of attributes, including green power, that they want to supply for their community. Next, please. So how does it operate? Traditionally, as I mentioned, we have generation, transmission, distribution, then end use consumption, and the power is produced at third-party, independently owned power companies in New England. They connect to the high voltage grid and inject their power, subject to the dispatch of the New England ISO, Independent System Operator of New England, a centralized grid operator working on transmission operations, transmission planning, collection of the dollars associated with transmission, and operating the competitive markets for power in New England, and determining through them which power plants will be dispatched. And traditionally, there has been a one-way flow of power from power plants injecting into the high voltage grid, then transforming down to lower voltages and delivered through low voltage to end use consumers. And let's go to the next. That one-way flow of power is changing, of course. And we're finding that with the availability of technology that is both grid connected, utility scale solar, for example, or microgrids or storage facilities that are on the low voltage system, or these behind the meter distributed energy resources like solar power, battery storage on a customer's premises, they are injecting into the grid as well when the local consumption doesn't absorb all of the power that's being produced. And so we see that the power flows on the system to be much more dynamic than in the past. And this requires new kinds of investment on the local grid to handle this new set of circumstances. The local grid has to interconnect more clean energy technologies and facilities. They have to support new demand that's going to be associated with increasing electrification of buildings that now use, say, natural gas or oil heating, propane heating and so forth, or electric vehicles, where, so for the most part, we haven't seen demand growth in electricity, but we're beginning to see an uptick in Massachusetts, in New England, and around the country associated with those electrified uses. And that will be the subject of some of the other working groups, by the way. And also, because the distribution system has to be more nimble, more intelligent, more robust, more dynamic, there are a number of controls that need to be put in place so that the grid operator at the local level, which is the local electric company, the local electric distribution company, has greater visibility into what's happening on the grid. So that's in addition to expansion of the capacity of the local grid, it has to be much smarter as well. Next, please. So Massachusetts, through the DPU, has required the electric utilities to develop electric sector modernization plans. These are strategic plans that identify, according to the EDC's view, those investments or types of categories investments that are needed to enable Massachusetts to handle these changes on the local grid. The electric utilities had to prepare 5 to 10 year demand forecast to see what's coming ahead. And they then have identified for the next 5 years the kinds of investments that they think are needed to handle these changes that will occur during that period, and to handle upfront investment for things beyond. The EDCs of the 3 investor-owned utilities in Massachusetts total $5 billion for the next 5 years, and include activities and investments and changes in the grid to talk about the capabilities that I discussed just a moment ago. In October of this year, the DPU approved, with modifications, these ESMPs, and there is a next phase of these proceedings in which the DPU will be reviewing the costs associated with these actual investments that the utilities will be making on the grid. Next. Massachusetts is not the only state undergoing these kinds of changes. Of course, there are a lot of other states that have renewable energy and clean energy and greenhouse gas reduction transitions underway in their energy systems. And there are implications in other states for the build out of the grid to handle these, not just the transmission grid, but again, the distribution system. And places that are illustrated here in these blue and green bars are places where, as in California, in Delaware, in Illinois, and in Maryland, each of which has its own clean energy laws and sets of regulations, the utilities in those states are undertaking investments to build out and modernize their grids to handle these kinds of current and upcoming changes. And you see here that in each set of bars, Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison over on the left for California, there has been a ratcheting up of the millions of dollars and other metrics of expansion of the grid. And then you can see there is Delaware, Illinois, and Maryland, which similarly show an upward trajectory of investment. Now, one of the reasons for the current working group on this topic is, of course, that if one were to expect to see these kinds of trajectories in Massachusetts, you would expect to see the distribution portion of rates going up, and there may be offsetting things going on in the supply side costs of the grid. But nonetheless, if all of this were to be financed through electricity rates, we might see pressure for affordability of rates. And therefore, one of the main purposes of this working group is to look for alternatives to make sure that we have a grid in the state that is robust, but also one that is affordable and accessible for everyone. Next, please. So, regulation of the utilities, prices, and services. The DPU regulates electric delivery rates. So, an electricity customer gets a bill. It goes through the review of the DPU to assure that the dollars on those bills reflect the terms and conditions and price levels that the DPU has approved. The DPU is an independent agency within EEA, but it has 3 commissioners appointed by the governor and operates in an independent fashion. It actually operates in a quasi-judicial way, and the electric distribution companies, those investor-owned utilities, can only change their rates if the DPU allows them to do so. And rates are reviewed and approved through formal legal proceedings, rate case dockets, in which the utility and other parties provide evidence. They provide testimony subject to cross-examination, and the DPU amasses the record of information that has been provided, makes determinations about what's evidence on which the DPU will make decisions about what costs to allow into rates, what changes are required, and so forth. Next, please. So in Massachusetts, as in many other states, the investor-owned utilities, or EDCs, operate under a cost of service model, which means that the electric distribution companies have the opportunity to present what it costs them to provide distribution service, and then to ask for a reasonable return or a profit on their investment. I'll go into that some more in just a moment. And those costs are associated with building, operating, and maintaining the electric distribution system. The way it works is that the EDC or the utility looks at its costs over the course of what's called a test year. It presents the data on what it costs to provide electricity service for residential customers, commercial customers, industrial customers, and that includes things like the computers to operate the grid, the computers to handle billing services, the trucks, the poles and wires associated with running the grid, the equipment associated with operating, and also the financing requirements that are associated with the utility borrowing money from providers of debt and obtaining the equity capital of its shareholders. In other words, these are investor-owned utilities for working capital and other purposes to finance. So I've just identified that there are both expenses that are reflected in the cost of providing services, and those are things like labor, fuel, maintenance of equipment, and the utility is not allowed to charge a markup for profit. So the expense of labor, the expense of buying fuel is examined in 1 year, and except for working capital and cash flow during that year, the utility does not earn a profit on those expenses. Those expenses also include a 1-year depreciation charge for using assets like the poles and wires, like the computers, and other things that have a life of more than 1 year. And then, in addition to those expenses on which there is not a return or a profit, the utility makes investments. And those are the cost to construct and finance power lines, to buy trucks, to build buildings and other equipment, again, that has a longer useful life. And the utility has an opportunity to have made those investments and then earn a profit on the portion of the investment that is not depreciated. In a rate case, which happens periodically, the utility files its cost of service, which is also considered to be the required revenues that it needs to collect in order to cover the cost of service. And the DPU examines that based on reviews that are also examined by the Attorney General, by interveners, consumer advocates, industrial advocates, environmental groups, to determine what should be allowed and disallowed in terms of the proposed investments and expenses in that cost of service. The DPU goes quite in detail to look at that, decides which things to allow into rates because they are justified. And the DPU also looks at the design of rates for households, for commercial customers, for industrial customers, so that their usage at a certain rate will produce enough dollars over the course of a year to cover that cost of service. And again, that's called the revenue requirement. Next, please. So let's think about investment. This is the portion of the cost of service associated with assets that the utility has made investments in that have a useful life more than 1 year in length of time. Once an investment has been made and is operational, in other words, it can be used and useful to provide utility service. So not necessarily during construction, but once it's actually fully constructed, that building is built, the wire is up and operating, then it can provide service. Then the utility requests that the dollars associated with that investment be included in the rate case as part of its revenue requirement. We've just spent this $100 million of additional investment on all of these assets. We would like to include that in our rate base. And the rate base is the dollar value of the utilities investment. The dollar value will change over time as an annual depreciation or use of that year's worth of the asset's life is depreciated. And as new investment is added back into rate base. So the rate base is changing over time, and the rate base that is undepreciated, that has not been expensed out through depreciation charges into rates. Isn't this fun, you guys? The undepreciated portion is the portion on which the utility has the opportunity to earn a profit. So next, please. Before I talk a little bit more about what the DPU does to allow a profit, the utilities raise capital in two ways. And the capital is used through borrowings from banks and other commercial lenders. Sometimes they're bonds, and those are loans to the utility. And the utility repays those over time with a debt repayment schedule that includes both interest and principal repayment of the bonds or the other loans. So that's debt. Additionally, an investor-owned utility is essentially borrowing the capital of its owners, who are the shareholders. And the EDC's utilities sell ownership shares on the stock market. And those ownership shares reflect the value that the market, the shareholders, ascribe to the value of the utility's investment in and its enterprise. So the utility borrows money from lenders through debt and from shareholders through equity. And when the DPU determines the amount of dollars to plug into the revenue requirements that is used to calculate what rates will look like and which will be charged to consumers, the DPU does a couple of things. The DPU is mindful of how much debt is out there for a particular utility, because it's going to vary by utility, and how much equity is in place. And the DPU will determine what it thinks is the preferred debt to equity ratio. It may be not what the actual one is, and it's designed to create an incentive by the regulator to have a share of cheaper lending through debt and more expensive borrowing from shareholders. It's to get a ratio of that mix, which reflects different kind of risks and different kind of costs. And so the DPU is going to find out the appropriate level of debt to equity. It will determine, based on examination of actual cost of debt of the utility, and it will set an allowed return on equity that the parties in the proceeding argue is the appropriate profit margin for a utility with the risk profile of one of the Massachusetts utilities. So the DPU establishes the allowed return on equity and builds that into rates, the cost of debt, and the preferred capital structure. And that is then through complicated formulas then built into the cost of service that is used to design rates. Next, please. So stepping back now, I've been talking for a moment about the distribution charge, but remember there are more charges on the customer bill than the distribution charges. And there are three basic ones. One of them is power supply, electricity production, and this is from power plants and other sources of supply, distant located, and some of these are local power sources. And that is, the cost of actually operating and constructing power plants, and that is 57% in the year that I happened to pull these rates, which was 2022. 57% of the customer's bill on average in Massachusetts was that power supply. That is federally regulated. That is not regulated as price terms by the DPU, with an asterisk associated with default service and so forth. Transmission charges reflect the cost of building, operating, and maintaining the high voltage regional system. And that's a quarter of the electricity charges. And the final quarter, or it's actually a fifth of electricity charges as they were in 2022, were these distribution charges, cost of building, operating, maintaining the local grid. And that also includes other programs like energy efficiency programs, the credits for renewable energy credits to induce the entry of new renewable capacity into the region and so forth. So those are state-run programs that show up on the customer's bills, and they are also reflected in the local delivery charges. So the rate that is shown on the left and the percentages, the actual dollar amounts or cents on the dollar, and the percentages will change from year to year as a function of, is it a high natural gas price year where the prices in New England's power supply are very much in line with what's happening in natural gas markets because of the nature of our electric market in the region? Are gas prices high or low? Are we seeing increased supply of renewables over time? And so that will go up or down depending upon those kinds of changing conditions. And we could expect to see that the dollar value of transmission and distribution rates can go up associated with the changing investment in the grid that is required for tomorrow's capabilities of the energy transition. Next, please. Melissa, I think I'm done and passing it back to you.
Sure. No, thank you, Sue, and really appreciate you going through that. I know there's a lot there, and it's it can be rather complex. So really appreciate you going through that and breaking it down. So again, just sort of summarizing what Sue just went through. As we're moving forward, as we're electrifying our economy and building out the grid to support that, both more electrified economy and also build resilience into the grid, we can expect additional investments will be needed through the electric sector modernization plans. As Sue mentioned, the utilities proposed 5 and 10-year plans of what they thought some of the investment needs might be to meet the electrification, clean energy, climate goals of the state, as well as build resilience into the system, and projecting kind of near term about an incremental $5 billion of investment. Currently, as Sue just went through with us, these investments are collected via rates, and we went through how we determine what the revenue requirements are. And as Sue mentioned, right, we're really talking about investments and expenses. Those are both included in a revenue requirement. And when we think about particularly the investment in infrastructure, that capital, that investment is really depreciated over a period of time. So while there might be upfront investment, the costs associated with that investment are actually recovered over a number of years, usually about a 30-year period. So it's not that it all goes into bills or to rates in the first year. It's collected over time. So I think that's just an important thing to recognize. When we see some of these numbers, all of these amounts aren't going to a bill today, they're going in over time. As Sue mentioned, we've been making investments. We've made investments and a lot of investments in infrastructure over the past several decades. And because of the wonderful programs that we have in Massachusetts, like Mass Save, we've been able to make those investments, and energy efficiency, demand response, all those programs have really helped mitigate bill impacts, particularly on that delivery portion of the bill. And so offsetting some of those investment costs. But as we move forward, we might be to a point where some of these savings that we've gotten from energy efficiency, et cetera, some of the investments might begin to outpace that. And that's why we're really here talking about this today with this focus area work group, to start thinking through what are alternative mechanisms for financing some of these infrastructure investments, and really focused on that distribution system infrastructure investment piece. And the reason why we're focused on that portion of it, and as Sue went through and showed in her slides, that really that's the portion that the state has the direct regulatory control over, which is that delivery portion of the bill. So how are we going to go through this, and how are we going to do this? As I mentioned, we're going to create this working group, Financing the Transition, and we're going to move through it in phases. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be having multiple phases as we move through this methodically. Today is sort of the part of that first phase, and really looking at how does rate making work today? How are costs recovered? What are the costs that are being recovered in some of the system investment needs? So that's going to be kind of part of phase one. We're also, as part of phase one, going to be looking at an inventory and assessment of existing cost recovery models. So we hit that a high level overview today, but going into some more detail about what we're doing here in Massachusetts, as well as around the country, just to understand what alternative mechanisms are today. And then also start to look at what are some non-utility financing models that are happening for public-private sector infrastructure financing models. So really to do that baseline, how does it work today? What are we doing in Massachusetts? What are folks doing elsewhere? And then what's happening outside of the utility industry that could provide us with models, with ideas. Then we'll move to phase two once we get through the first phase, to understand what the costs and impacts are of these alternative financing structures. As Sue mentioned, both capital, access to capital, cost of capital, as well as how would you raise revenues to pay for those investments. And then finally, looking through what are some of the policy regulatory requirements to potentially support any alternatives. So a little bit of a deeper dive into that phase one. So again, kicking it off today with the webinar, and then really going through what are our investment needs and costs. So again, we'll be doing this over the course of the remainder of the fall and winter. The projections as identified in each of the EDC's electric sector modernization plans, broad categorizations of the types of investments and vis-a-vis the different goals, comparison to other states. And again, we'll do a deeper dive into the recovery mechanisms, current cost recovery mechanisms in Massachusetts, recovery mechanisms in use in other states and regions, and then really looking at other financing options, public-private infrastructure partnerships. What did we do when we went through industry restructuring here in Massachusetts? For those not familiar with that, about 2 decades ago or so, our utilities here used to own the power plants, the transmission, and the distribution infrastructure. It was one vertically integrated utility. A few decades ago, we broke those businesses up, and we have now competitive power suppliers, as Sue showed us. Those power suppliers, those power plant owners, they operate in that competitive wholesale market. And the utilities in Massachusetts, the electric distribution companies are responsible for the delivery portion, the electric distribution grid, and then we have transmission owners, some of whom are the electric distribution companies, some might be competitive transmission owners, all kind of operating in this market. And when we did that, we had to think of different ways of looking at financing, different ways of looking at cost recovery. And so we're going to be looking at how did we do some of that then, and are there any examples that we can take and bring forward into the work that we're doing today. So what's the timing of all this? Today, we're starting off with our webinar launch, our primer. And then we'll, once we get the working group up and running and everybody decides who wants to participate, we get folks signed up. We'll be then kicking off in November, December, doing a both virtual and in person. All of the working groups will be virtual and in-person opportunities to make it accessible to everybody. So we'll do a deeper dive into the overview of utility investment plans from the ESMPs and customer bill impacts associated with these investments and look at the current state of cost recovery. So we'll do that in November, December. Then in January, we'll do a review of electric distribution system financing approaches that are used or being considered in other jurisdictions. So again, what are some of those other mechanisms? And then finally, in February, we'll provide an update. We'll develop an update to the advisory board and we'll close out phase 1. Then we will provide that information to the advisory board, get their feedback, and we'll launch phase 2. And phase 2 is really that alternatives assessment. So really phase 1 is getting the grounding, getting the understanding of what the potential opportunities are out there, what we're doing today, what are opportunities in terms of alternatives going forward, align around what the potentials could be, share that with the advisory board, get feedback, allow them to ask questions, and then we'll be in a position in the spring to kick off a phase 2, which is then really doing a deeper dive into what some of those alternatives might be, the pros and cons, the costs, the implications for accessing capital, et cetera. So that's the approach. That's how we're planning this. Again, all meetings will be both Zoom and in person. So if you'd like to sign up and participate in one of the focus area work groups, there will be a link that'll be provided in the chat to the Office of Energy Transformation website. So you can go there and then there'll be a link for the sign up. You can also review the bylaws, the ground rules, and the approved work plans. They're also available on the Energy Transformation website. So more detail into, again, some of the governance expectations, how we're going to move forward, what the advisory board approved. We're going to have the registration open until October 28th, and then we'll send confirmations out by November 6th. And again, we'll be doing a first convening of this FOG in late November. So that's what we have in terms of a presentation today. And I'm going to go. I think we have a few questions. So if you want to come back on and we can go through some of the questions. Let's see. First question I have here is, what does transmission and distribution automation entail? Do you want to start? And I'm happy to
Perfect.
jump in.
Everything about the electric system is highly, highly automated. So on the electric distribution system and transmission system, you have metering that captures the amount of use in some meters over time, over an hour, over a month, whatever. In some instances, it is real-time activity of the power flows on the grid or the sales to an end-use consumer. So there's metering and monitoring of the system. The operator of the system also has to be able to see visibly what's happening in terms of the power flows, the frequency, all sorts of other metrics that are highly technical, that are associated with keeping the grid in balance all the time, which is necessary to keep the lights on. So many of those controls are highly automated and sending signals to the operators all the time. So I'm using those as examples from the monitoring, controlled metering of operations of the grid to what's happening relative to the customer. And I don't think have any non-automated metering in Massachusetts anymore, in the sense that the utility goes out and collects data rather than a person going to a premise of a customer, but there's a transportation system that is automated and collects data from the grid. The modeling that the utility does financially, that is highly automated. So think of this as a highly as an industry that's highly dependent on data analytics, and increasingly so for the resilience issues that Melissa mentioned.
Thanks. So, and just to build a little bit on that, there's been a lot of effort to modernize the grid in Massachusetts over the past decade. And actually, there's been several proceedings on grid modernization that have allowed for utilities to make certain investments. And Sue touched on one of them, automated metering infrastructure, or AMI. That's today we have, as Sue mentioned, AMR, kind of automated meter reads, where you don't necessarily need to have folks go to a premise, although sometimes that happens. But you can kind of drive around and get the meter reads. Going forward, though, the utilities are all going to be putting in what are called automated metering infrastructure, AMI, which will actually be more like a two-way communication device. And by doing that, it'll provide reads more often, but also allow for communication between the utility system as well as the customer premise. And that will unlock and enable a lot more in terms of bill management, energy management, customer side management of their energy, and also unlock a lot of the potential that we see for distributed energy resources, including solar storage, managed charging. So lots of things will be unlocked for the customer to both manage bills and also for visibility on the system from the distribution side of the meter. Similarly, utilities are adding a lot of automation in terms on the poles and wires that will allow them to have more visibility into the system so they can better understand how it's operating, be able to better identify when an issue could be occurring, so to get out there in advance, but also to create what's known as sort of a self-healing grid, so it can better detect where there might be an issue on the grid. So let's say during a storm, a tree branch comes down, touches the grid. Previously, it might take out the whole line. Now there's technology on the grid where can kind of close the system in, so it can identify where that fault might be and start to close customers in automatically without having to send a truck out there and send folks out there to look at the line. It can figure it out and really reduce the duration of outages. So there's lots of opportunity that's happening. But as Sue said, there's a lot of both technology hardware that needs to be deployed, and a lot of back-end software that needs to be deployed so that the utilities could take in the information and the data and apply it to the system, both to help run it, operate it better, but provide more value to the customer and more affordability going forward. So
Could I just mention
the question?
And let me mention two other things that are not within the box, literally, of the distribution system itself, but the generation of electricity is also highly automated, where the grid operator, who's like an orchestra conductor and has to see the output of plants and what's happening in terms of people withdrawing power by plugging things in and turning lights on and so forth. So those have to be kept in balance. And so the grid operator sends signals to power plants to rev up. That's not a technical term, or ramp down their output to keep in balance. And the same is true in seeing what's happening in terms of power being injected into the grid from, say, rooftop solar. It's more visibility about what's happening that way. And the other thing is that customers will have more automated capabilities on their appliances and energy uses, so that, as Melissa said, can be tied into energy management systems that creates more flexibility and helpful sophistication of the customers' managing of their bill and managing of their electricity use.
Great, thank you. Next question was, is there a review of what delivery bill growth was for the historic time period for utilities in other states on page 15? Don't have that with us, but that's actually a great question. And when we do the deeper dive, we'll make sure that we do some of the historic usage. I would caution a little bit of the California utilities, just given what's happened out there vis-a-vis wildfires. We'd have to kind of look at that a little bit separately, because that really, has had a significant impact for a variety of reasons. I could just sort of say anecdotally for the Mid-Atlantic utilities, historically, their bills have been rather flat for a number of years, partially due to energy efficiency savings and partially due to other um, to tax law that was passed back in the 2017 time period, and also some other kind of regulatory mechanisms. So I think we'll have to kind of figure out a way to do it more of an apples to apples comparison, because sometimes it's a little challenging to do that, because we regulate at the state level, and so there's differences for different states. But it's a great question.
It's a great question. Let me just add to that. A little known fact often is that electricity prices over time, even though there have been times when you have felt a big pinch in terms of a bill increase, in part because of natural gas price increases in this region. Over time, inflation adjusted prices, I mean, the electricity rates over time have not gone much higher than inflation. So it won't look that way when we provide the information, but it's a great thing that we can provide as part of this working group.
Yeah. We had a question, will the role of avoiding new gas pipe repair costs be part of this conversation, since there may be money there that can help in financing the transition? We'll be looking, that's a great question, and it's something that we'll have to figure out how we can bring into the conversation. In Massachusetts, again, we've got customers that are dual fuel customers, gas electric. They may get their gas electric from the same provider. We have lots of folks that have split utilities, gas electric. You get your electric from one, your gas from another. And then we have a number of folks in Massachusetts, I think about a quarter to a third or so, that might get electricity service, but actually have delivered fuels for heating and cooking. And so we're going to have to sort of think through that issue, because it could be very obvious in certain cases, and in other cases not so much. And so we're going to have to figure out how we look at the total cost and total impact of that. But it's a great question. Then we had a question about energy burden, and great question on that one too. Just a couple of things on energy burden. So the question was, the systems described in the presentation has given us high energy burdens among LMI households relative to their income. Will this process factor in that inequity of the model as it is? So a couple of things on that. One, I think it's really, if you think about electric bills, right, there's sort of two pieces. There's the investment, and then the amount of that investment that actually then gets put on a bill. And then we have the rate design of then how do we allocate those costs among customer classes. So Sue kind of talked through that, right? So you make the investment, then it's how much of that investment goes in the bill. Then within that, how do you actually structure rates? What this working group is really focused on is kind of the first parts of that. On rate design, there's actually a working group happening right now at the DPU. They have an affordability docket that's looking at this issue, as well as there's an interagency working group on rate design that's also looking at this. So this issue is actually being discussed right now at the DPU from an affordability perspective. And one other thing to note, in the recent National Grid rate case that was recently the order that just recently came out from the DPU, National Grid actually proposed to transition its low-income discount rate from a flat rate to one to address energy burden. And the DPU did approve that. So now we have tiered discount rates to get at energy burden. One thing to recognize from discount rates is there also is legislation and legislatively mandated in terms of which customers are eligible for taking advantage of that discount rate. So there is an income eligibility that does actually require legislative change to apply that discount to more customers beyond, I think it's 60% of household median income in Massachusetts. So great question. A lot of activity on it, trying to address it, both in the affordability docket, also the recently approved energy National Grid rate case. to get to energy burden, and we need to look at income eligibility in the context of that. So that is something that's going to be sort of, I think, discussed not within this, but it's something that is being discussed. And so they will be related, and we can definitely make the linkage, and that can be a recommendation that comes out that we need to really factor that in. But this work group's going to focus very much on the investment and what investment is actually going to go on the bill in the first place. And Sue, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, it's a great segue from the point you just made, which is if you agree, if the Commonwealth agrees that a certain amount of money should be invested to enable the grid to transition, how much of that needs to come on the customer's bills and be part of that energy burden analysis. So this group is looking at, well, what could you do elseways? You know, what are the great ideas that people have about other forms of financing besides doing on electricity customers' bills? And that is inherently to address the affordability question.
Great. Thank you. We had a comment about smart meters for appropriate price and use incentives. Yes, we absolutely, and I think, as I mentioned, all the utilities are in the process of deploying smart meters of the AMI technology. They should be fully deployed, I think, by the 2020 end of 2028 time period. They had all just recently received approval in a recent grid mod order about 18, 24, maybe 24 months ago or so, maybe a little longer. So that rollout is starting now across the state. So that will be very helpful. Under current statutes, could this process result in entities other than EDCs becoming eligible to receive funding from the rate base to install and maintain distribution grid upgrades? If so, could you speak to any specific examples of what type of upgrades could be financed in this way? Privately managed virtual power plants. Great question. And I think, when you look at mitigation of, cost mitigation, affordability, one of the things that will be enabled from the investments that we're seeing in some of the electric sector modernization plans is this use of what's called non-wire alternatives, of which a virtual power plant is one of them. So if you sort of think about what Sue went through, there's traditional infrastructure investment, your poles, your wires, your substations. Those are the utilities invest in those, in that infrastructure to help meet electric demand and to meet capacity needs. So as we electrify more things, we need more capacity in the system to serve more of that electric load. If you think about an opportunity on the customer side of the meter to actually either reduce that demand or aggregate things like customer-owned solar and storage and almost create their own power generation source on the customer side of the meter, on the distribution side, could that be then used to offset some of this load growth that we're seeing? So really with this concept of a virtual power plant. So while they might be mini power plants, or they might be demand response, or they might be the ability to aggregate customers to offset demand that would then avoid the need to do that infrastructure upgrade. So absolutely, that's a great one. And that's something that we can bring into this conversation about how and what's needed to do that, and what are some of the mechanisms that might be needed to do that. We'll also be touching on that in the working group on decarbonizing the peak, because on that working group specifically, we are going to be looking at supply and demand side opportunities for meeting peak electricity demand. As we know, over time, our system is going to be a system where we have higher peak electricity needs as we electrify heating, and we electrify more of our economy. Between electrifying heating and transportation, we are expecting to see that peak grow and maybe more than double between now and 2050. And so in order to figure out ways to meet that demand without having to build more power plants or rely more on fossil fuels, are there ways to actually kind of shave that peak or mitigate that peak on the demand side? And so we'll be looking at that in that working group, but obviously there'll be some intersection between the two. And so we can bring some of those findings and learnings in, and we can ask some questions in this working group about how we can use this demand side to maybe, again, address affordability and minimize the amount of investment we need to make. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, I want to add just kind of an educational point to the participants here. The question poses an interesting thing, which is, could you use some of the utilities funding from rate base to have a third party perform various services? And Melissa talked about that. That approach still uses electricity rates to pay for some investment. And if this is, basically asking the utility to go out and procure services from a third party, it's still, at the end of the day, in that discussion, has it showing up in customers' rates. And maybe cheaper if you could find a more efficient way to do it that way. And the cheaper, the better. That's great. But we also want to look at things outside of utility rates and outside of the utilities rate base as mechanisms for funding. And so that's also one of the charges here. So I just wanted to remind the participants that we're outside of the norm here in terms of where we're going to go eventually.
Great, thank you, Sue. That's a good clarification. So next question we have, when and how can we consider the costs associated with the cleaning of our power system and ending the use of fossil fuels, particularly gas, which is linked to the electric companies? Great question. And that is the decarbonizing the peak. We're going to be talking about that in that focus area, which is, again, cleaning our power system. So how can we become less reliant on or eliminate our reliance on fossil fuel fired peaking power plants, looking at both demand and supply side options. So that is kind of one of the things that we're going to be looking at in that group. And then the other working group we have, transitioning away from Everett Marine Terminal LNG facility, that really is looking at that gas to electric transition. So we have one working group looking at how are we kind of cleaning up the generation stack, and another working group that's looking at how then do we transition away from reliance on sort of a large natural gas asset, aligned with the state's goals, which is really an electrification-based pathway. So we're going to be looking at that in those two working groups. We have a question: will financing the transition for municipally owned utilities be addressed by this work group? No, that's not something we're going to be looking at in this work group at this time. We're really looking at the investor-owned electric distribution companies in this work group. Will there be any fog work related?
Actually, I just want to say, while agreeing exactly with what you said, there could be things that this working group touches on that could be relevant for municipals. So it's just like the side effect.
Absolutely. But yes, and they will not be the focus. They primarily, one of the things is they do primarily use debt financing for them. Will there be a fog related to financing offshore wind projects? Not currently. We're not looking at that piece of it, but that could be something that the advisory board at some point raises and says that's something that we think should be looked at. And if they do, then that would be another working group that we could stand up, or maybe adjacent to this one. But currently, the 3 work groups that have been approved and their scope and missions, those have been approved by the advisory board, and so that's the initial focus of the office. So I think we touched on this one a little bit. The ES&Ps, from what I understand, did not recognize any technological advancements, i.e. V2G, EVs becoming a reliable electric storage resource, or other quick improvements to improve carrying capacity of existing lines. Does the FOG need to propose investments that enhance economic use of the existing infrastructure? I think we touched on that a bit earlier. And I think, when you go back and look at some of the ES&Ps, I think, both all the utilities did propose pilots around that, and part of where they will be moving to is when they are able to make some of the other investments. As Sue and I touched on earlier in the automation question, there's a lot of sort of back-end systems that need to be put in place to better optimize and enable some of the V2G and managed charging programs. And I think you'll start to see more of those as opportunities. And again, in the decarbonizing the peak, we'll really be looking at that demand side piece of it, of how do we leverage those to help us clean up the generation stack on the supply side. So the inquiry is only focused on electric system delivery costs. Should we be examining how our entire energy system costs should be funded? That would be great question. And I think, that definitely could be something that, again, the advisory board could say we want to take a larger holistic look. Or one of the reasons why we focus primarily on the distribution system and delivery side was because that is, as Sue went forward, that is what we as Massachusetts and the state have direct control over. As you noted and Sue noted, right, we have ISO New England, we have FERC in the other areas. And so we really wanted to focus on things that as a state that we had direct control over, and so that we could, see what kind of progress that we could make. Is there a list of likely subgroup topics we could reference? Yes, if you go on the Office of Energy Transformation website and go to the financing the transition in the bylaws, there it does show the approved work plan and work streams, as well as I think you saw in this deck. This is also available on the Office of Energy Transformation website. You can see the phases and what some of the work streams are going to be within those phases. Next question, how about the cost of electrifying our grid in addition to managing the result of electrification? I think that's, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that is partially what we're looking at in terms of the ESMPs, that those investments are to enable, broader electrification of the economy. And I think some of what's in this question is also, as you do electrify more, and Sue, please, you're the expert here. As we do electrify more, and we do have, more load on the system, more electricity usage, that we will be able to spread some of those costs over kind of more usage, right? So if you sort of think of the numerator and denominator kind of effect, when you have a larger denominator, I'm getting all this
sales base. Yeah,
it's right. Then it brings down kind of the overall rate that's being paid. So I think that is an important point, that as you do electrify more, right, that you have a broader base over which to spread some of these costs. So we will be taking a look at that, and that is something. And then obviously, right, we have the energy efficiency on the other side. So I think that's why it's a very dynamic. It's a very dynamic system, and so we'll be definitely getting into that piece of that. So anything else you want to comment on there?
Yeah, that's it.
Great. All other things being equal, does a discount for low-income customers mean a higher rate for market rate customers? If yes, is this work group focused on how cost of the transition is divvied up and passed on to customers? How to reduce the total cost of the transition, inclusive of expenses and investments, or both? So I think we touched on a little bit of that in terms of mitigating some of the need for investment through, right, demand side actions and customer actions that absolutely can help kind of mitigate some investment needs. There are some investments that have to be made in order to be able to deploy those technologies, and some policies that need to be looked at in order to be able to really leverage those and optimize that side of the equation. In terms of discount rates and as we move towards more of an energy burden kind of approach, yes, if you think about rate design, if there's a segment of customers that are paying less, then the remainder of those costs will have to be borne by other customer classes. And so that is typically, now again, there's different ways of looking and how to do that, and that's what some of the rates working group is looking at, as well as the affordability docket that the DPU has kicked off, and they're digging into that now. But essentially, if you sort of think about when we decide what investments are going to go on bills, then we figure out how to allocate those costs. And so, if you kind of push one place, you have to figure out a way to make up for it someplace else. And so that's essentially why we're kind of looking at it in segments of how do we minimize the amount of investment that can actually go on a bill. So anything you want to add there?
Yeah, let me use the question about whether or not we're thinking about how the overall transition costs to a more decarbonized energy system are passed on to consumers. You know, if you think about consumers, just budgets of households or of a university or of a small business, they have budgets for electricity, they have budgets for heating, which may not be electricity, and so they may have a natural gas bill. They have trucks and cars and other things, so that's a gasoline or diesel bill. So their energy budget includes those commodity purchases, but also equipment. So there's a whole lot of things to think about what makes up the cost of energy to consumers. And one of the things right now is low-income customers are subsidized by non-low-income customers. And there are other ways to think about designing, who picks up costs of affordability. We'll hear about some other designs of how the tax budget or financial institutions using incentives to leverage private investment markets change the dynamics of consumers' budgets between, a piece of energy using equipment and their gas or electric and or gasoline bills. And so we will probably talk about, those big pies and how the dollars might shift from one pie to another, including how to get them outside of electricity rates. Electricity rates tend to, in general across the United States, tend to have a higher burden on poor people than taxes. And so thinking about alternatives for all of this is part of the topic of discussion in this, to think about those different pies and how to see whether or not, don't know, whether or not there's views of the groups that would go outside of these traditional ways to finance investment.
Great, thank you. So I think that was all the questions. We got through all of them, so thank you. And just as a reminder, in the chat, there is the link to the working group sign up as well as to the website. So the deck is available on the website as well as the bylaws, so you can dig in more. Again, we're closing the sign up by October 28th. So you can look at what's there, you can think about it, and please, if you're interested and want to dig in, as I said, there is going to be sweat equity involved in participating in this work group. We are going to get the support of Sue and her colleague Paul Hibbard, also a former chair of the Department of Public Utilities here in Massachusetts, as well as analysis group. They're going to be helping to support the effort along the way, which is fantastic, and we really appreciate that. And I know that we're going to have a lot of great engagement from many of you who both asked questions today, and then also I saw that we're part of the of today's webinar. So again, I just want to thank everybody for their interest, for tuning in. The recording of this should be available within a week or so on the website, but the deck is there now, and we'll make sure that in the next 24 hours, the sign up link is also available on the website. So with that, again, I will say thank you to everybody for participating. Thank you, Sue, for joining. Thank you, Hayden, for helping to put all this together. And with that, I will say end the call.